The investigation also revealed the extent to which Dahmer had been able to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing his crimes. Co-workers at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company described him as a quiet, reliable employee who performed his duties adequately and caused no problems. Neighbors knew him as a polite, if somewhat odd, tenant who kept to himself and rarely caused disturbances. This ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior and present a normal exterior to the world had been crucial in allowing him to continue killing for so long. The geographic pattern of Dahmer's crimes revealed his careful selection of hunting grounds and his understanding of which victims were least likely to be missed. He frequented gay bars, bus stations, shopping malls, and other locations where vulnerable young men could be found. His approach was always the same. He would offer money for photographs, drinks, or sexual services, then lure victims to his apartment where he would drug them before beginning his murderous ritual. The drugging of victims was a crucial element of Dahmer's method, allowing him to incapacitate them without the physical struggle that might alert neighbors or leave evidence of resistance. He typically used sleeping pills dissolved in alcohol, though he also experimented with other drugs and chemicals. The use of drugs also fit with his fantasy of creating compliant, controllable partners who would submit to his desires without resistance. The preservation and collection of body parts revealed another disturbing aspect of Dahmer's psychology: his need to maintain physical mementos of his victims. The skulls found in his apartment had been carefully cleaned and preserved, some painted or decorated according to Dahmer's aesthetic preferences. These trophies served both as reminders of his crimes and as objects that he believed contained the essence of his victims, allowing him to maintain a connection with them after death. The photographic documentation of his crimes showed a level of narcissism and pride in his work that was particularly chilling. Dahmer had systematically photographed his victims before, during, and after the murders, creating a visual record of his crimes that he apparently used for later gratification. These photographs also revealed the progression of his crimes over time, showing how his methods had become more elaborate and his post-mortem mutilations more extensive. The failure of multiple systems to detect or stop Dahmer's crimes became a subject of intense scrutiny and criticism. The criminal justice system had failed when it gave him minimal punishment for the 1988 sexual assault of a minor. The mental health system had failed to recognize and treat his obvious psychological disorders. The social services system had failed to monitor his compliance with probation requirements. Law enforcement had failed to properly investigate complaints and missing person reports that might have led to his earlier capture. Perhaps most tragically, the broader community had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. Many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color, immigrants, or individuals struggling with homelessness, addiction, or their sexual identity. Their marginalized status had made them easy targets for a predator who understood that their disappearances were unlikely to generate intensive police investigations or sustained media attention. The racial and social dynamics of Dahmer's crimes could not be ignored. Of his 17 confirmed victims, 11 were African American, 2 were Laotian, 1 was Native American, and 3 were white. This pattern suggested that Dahmer had deliberately targeted minority victims, possibly because he believed they were less likely to be missed, or that investigations into their disappearances would be less thorough. The response to missing person reports involving Dahmer's victims had indeed been inconsistent, with some cases receiving minimal attention while others were more thoroughly investigated. The gay community in Milwaukee was particularly affected by Dahmer's crimes, as many of his victims had been members of this already marginalized population. The discovery that a serial killer had been targeting gay men for over a decade raised concerns about safety and highlighted the vulnerability of a community that already faced significant discrimination and violence. Gay rights advocates argued that homophobia had contributed to the inadequate response to missing person reports and the failure to recognize the pattern of disappearances. As the investigation neared completion, the full scope of Dahmer's crimes had been established, but many questions remained unanswered. The exact number of his victims was uncertain, as Dahmer's confessions were sometimes inconsistent, and investigators suspected there might be additional murders that had not been discovered. The psychological mechanisms that had driven him to such extreme violence were still not fully understood, despite extensive analysis by mental health professionals. The case had exposed fundamental flaws in multiple systems designed to protect public safety, and had highlighted the particular vulnerability of marginalized communities to predatory violence. The failures that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long were not simply the result of individual incompetence, but reflected deeper problems with how society responded to reports of missing persons, domestic violence, and other crimes affecting vulnerable populations. The investigation phase of the Jeffrey Dahmer case was drawing to a close, but the legal proceedings that would follow would raise even more troubling questions about justice, mental illness, and society's response to crimes that challenged basic assumptions about human nature. The man who had seemed so ordinary to his neighbors and co-workers had been revealed as one of the most depraved killers in American history, and the full implications of his crimes were only beginning to be understood. The legal proceedings against Jeffrey Dahmer began with his arraignment on charges that encompassed some of the most serious crimes in the American criminal justice system. On July 25, 1991, just 3 days after his arrest, Dahmer appeared before Judge Frank Crivello in Milwaukee County Circuit Court to face formal charges of murder, sexual assault, and various other felonies related to his horrific crimes. The defendant who stood before the court bore little resemblance to the confident, articulate man who had convinced police officers to return Conorak's synthesomphone to his apartment just weeks earlier. Dressed in an orange jail jumpsuit and wearing his characteristic wire-rimmed glasses, Dahmer appeared withdrawn and subdued as the charges against him were read. The initial complaint filed by the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office included 4 counts of first-degree murder, though investigators made it clear that additional charges would likely follow as the investigation continued and more victims were identified. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' family members, and curious onlookers who had come to catch a glimpse of the man whose crimes had shocked the nation. The question of legal representation became immediately complicated due to the unprecedented nature and scope of Dahmer's crimes. Public defenders were initially assigned to the case, but the complexity of defending someone accused of such extensive and depraved criminal activity required specialized expertise. Gerald Boyle, a prominent Milwaukee defense attorney with experience in high-profile criminal cases, was eventually retained to lead Dahmer's defense team. Boyle faced the nearly impossible task of mounting a defense for crimes that appeared to have overwhelming evidence and had already been partially confessed to by his client. From the beginning, it was clear that the defense strategy would center on mental illness rather than denial of the charges. Dahmer had already provided detailed confessions to investigators, admitting to killing 17 people over a 13-year period and describing his crimes in graphic detail. The physical evidence found in his apartment corroborated his confessions, making denial impossible. Instead, Boyle would argue that Dahmer was not legally responsible for his actions due to mental illness, specifically that he was legally insane at the time of the murders. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of crimes so horrific that they risked overwhelming and traumatizing jurors. The case required careful handling to ensure that the graphic nature of the evidence did not prevent a fair trial while still adequately demonstrating the premeditated and methodical nature of Dahmer's crimes. The prosecution's strategy was to show that despite his obvious mental illness, Dahmer understood the wrongfulness of his actions and was therefore legally responsible for his crimes. As additional charges were filed, the scope of the case continued to expand. By the time the case went to trial, Dahmer faced 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin, plus additional charges in Ohio for the 1978 murder of Stephen Hicks. The Wisconsin charges carried the possibility of life imprisonment without parole, as the state did not have a death penalty. This fact would prove significant in plea negotiations and trial strategy, as it removed the ultimate sanction from consideration. The pretrial phase was marked by extensive psychological evaluation of the defendant. Both the prosecution and defense retained prominent forensic psychiatrists and psychologists to examine Dahmer and provide expert testimony about his mental state. These evaluations would be crucial in determining whether Dahmer met the legal standard for insanity. Specifically, whether he was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of his crimes, or was unable to conform his conduct to the requirements of law. Dr. George Palermo, one of the court-appointed psychiatrists, conducted extensive interviews with Dahmer and concluded that while he suffered from various personality disorders and paraphilias, he did not meet the legal standard for insanity. Palermo's evaluation found that Dahmer understood the illegality and immorality of his actions, as evidenced by his elaborate efforts to conceal his crimes and avoid detection. The methodical nature of his killing and body disposal showed planning and awareness that contradicted claims of legal insanity. The defense retained their own mental health experts, including Dr. Judith Becker, who argued that Dahmer's severe mental illness, including necrophilia and other paraphilias, had rendered him unable to control his behavior. The defense team's psychiatric experts maintained that Dahmer's crimes were the product of irresistible impulses driven by profound mental disease, making him legally insane regardless of his intellectual understanding of right and wrong. The question of Dahmer's competency to stand trial was also raised, though this was ultimately resolved in favor of proceeding with the case. While clearly mentally ill, Dahmer demonstrated sufficient understanding of the charges against him and was able to assist in his own defense, meeting the basic requirements for competency. His detailed confessions and apparent understanding of the legal proceedings indicated that he was capable of participating meaningfully in his trial. On January 13, 1992, nearly 6 months after his arrest, Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in Milwaukee County Circuit Court before Judge Lawrence Graham. The case had attracted unprecedented media attention, with reporters from around the world descending on Milwaukee to cover what many considered the trial of the century. The selection of a jury proved challenging, as pretrial publicity had made it difficult to find potential jurors who had not already formed opinions about Dahmer's guilt and mental state. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant District Attorney Michael McCann, laid out a methodical case designed to prove that despite his obvious mental illness, Dahmer was legally responsible for his crimes. McCann argued that the evidence would show Dahmer's crimes were planned and deliberate, that he understood the wrongfulness of his actions, and that he took elaborate steps to avoid detection. The systematic nature of his crimes, his ability to maintain employment and relationships, and his careful selection and luring of victims all demonstrated a functioning criminal mind, McCann contended. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle's opening statement acknowledged his client's guilt, but argued that the crimes were the product of a diseased mind that was incapable of conforming to legal and moral standards. Boyle painted a picture of a profoundly disturbed individual whose mental illness had progressed to the point where he was driven by irresistible compulsions. The defense strategy was not to excuse Dahmer's crimes, but to explain them as the inevitable result of severe mental disease that rendered him legally insane. The prosecution's case unfolded over several days, with testimony from police officers, forensic experts, and medical examiners who described the crime scene and the evidence of Dahmer's systematic killing and dismemberment of his victims. Detective Patrick Kennedy testified about the horrific discoveries in apartment 213, describing the severed heads in the refrigerator, the acid-filled containers with dissolved remains, and the photographs documenting Dahmer's crimes. The testimony was so graphic that several jurors appeared visibly disturbed, and the judge had to call frequent recesses. Forensic pathologist Dr. Jeffrey Jensen provided detailed testimony about the condition of the victims' remains and the methods used to kill and dismember them. His testimony established that the victims had been killed through various means: strangulation, drugging, and blunt force trauma, and that extensive post-mortem mutilation had occurred. The systematic nature of the dismemberment and the evidence of necrophilia and cannibalism painted a picture of crimes that went far beyond simple murder. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played audio recordings of Dahmer's confessions to police. In these recordings, Dahmer described his crimes in chilling detail, explaining his methods of luring victims, his techniques for drugging and killing them, and his elaborate rituals involving their bodies after death. His calm, matter-of-fact tone, while describing acts of unspeakable depravity, was perhaps more disturbing than the crimes themselves. The prosecution also presented evidence of Dahmer's attempts to create zombies by drilling holes in victims' skulls and injecting acid into their brains. This evidence was particularly significant because it demonstrated planning and experimentation that suggested a functioning, if deeply disturbed, mind. The fact that Dahmer had researched and attempted to perfect these techniques over time contradicted claims that his crimes were the result of uncontrollable impulses. The defense case centered on extensive psychiatric testimony designed to prove that Dahmer was legally insane at the time of his crimes. Dr. Fred Berlin, a renowned expert on sexual disorders, testified that Dahmer suffered from necrophilia and other severe paraphilias that rendered him unable to control his behavior. Berlin argued that Dahmer's sexual attraction to dead bodies was a form of mental illness that drove him to kill in order to satisfy his pathological desires. Dr. Carl Wallstrom, another defense psychiatric expert, testified that Dahmer suffered from borderline personality disorder and other mental illnesses that had progressively worsened over time. Wallstrom argued that by the time of the murders, Dahmer's mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was unable to conform his conduct to legal requirements, meeting the standard for legal insanity under Wisconsin law. The defense also presented evidence of Dahmer's troubled childhood and family background, attempting to show how his mental illness had developed over time. Testimony about his parents' troubled marriage, his mother's mental health issues, and his early fascination with dead animals was presented to provide context for his later criminal behavior. However, the prosecution successfully argued that while these factors might explain Dahmer's development as a killer, they did not excuse his crimes or render him legally insane. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on evidence that Dahmer understood the wrongfulness of his actions and took deliberate steps to avoid detection. They pointed to his careful selection of victims, his elaborate methods of disposal, and his ability to maintain normal relationships and employment as evidence of a functioning criminal mind. The prosecution argued that legal insanity required more than just mental illness. It required a complete inability to understand right from wrong or to control one's behavior. Dr. George Palermo, testifying for the prosecution, provided perhaps the most damaging testimony against the insanity defense. Palermo had conducted extensive interviews with Dahmer and concluded that while he suffered from various personality disorders, he did not meet the legal standard for insanity. Palermo testified that Dahmer's crimes showed planning, organization, and awareness of their illegality, all of which contradicted claims of legal insanity. The question of whether Dahmer's mental illness rendered him legally insane became the central issue of the trial. Both sides presented compelling expert testimony, But the prosecution had the advantage of Wisconsin's strict legal standard for insanity, which required proof that the defendant was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or was unable to conform his conduct to legal requirements due to mental disease or defect. On February 15, 1992, after deliberating for just 5 hours, the jury returned their verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty but sane on all 15 counts of murder. The verdict meant that while the jury acknowledged Dahmer's obvious mental illness, they concluded that he was legally responsible for his crimes and should be punished accordingly. The relatively brief deliberation suggested that the jury found the prosecution's evidence compelling and was not convinced by the defense's insanity argument. Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. In a brief statement before sentencing, Dahmer expressed remorse for his crimes and apologized to the families of his victims. However, his words carried little weight given the magnitude of his crimes and his history of manipulation and deception. The verdict was met with satisfaction by most observers, who felt that justice had been served despite Dahmer's obvious mental illness. The families of victims expressed relief that Dahmer would never be free to kill again, though many struggled with the knowledge that no punishment could truly account for the suffering their loved ones had endured. The case had demonstrated that even the most severely mentally ill defendants could be held legally responsible for their crimes if they retained basic understanding of right and wrong. The Ohio charges for the murder of Stephen Hicks were resolved separately, with Dahmer pleading guilty and receiving an additional life sentence. This ensured that even if his Wisconsin convictions were somehow overturned on appeal, he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. The legal proceedings had finally concluded, but the broader implications of Dahmer's crimes for society, criminal justice, and our understanding of human evil were only beginning to be fully understood. The trial had been a watershed moment in American criminal justice, forcing courts to grapple with questions about the relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. The case had also highlighted the particular challenges of defending clients whose crimes were so depraved that they challenged basic assumptions about human nature and the possibility of rehabilitation. The verdict affirmed that legal insanity remained a difficult defense to mount successfully, even in cases involving obviously disturbed defendants. The conclusion of Jeffrey Dahmer's trial marked the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, but the impact of his crimes would continue to reverberate through society for years to come. The case had forced the nation to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the failures of various social institutions, and the vulnerability of marginalized communities to predatory violence. The legal resolution had provided some measure of closure, but the deeper issues raised by Dahmer's crimes would continue to challenge society's understanding of justice, mental health, and human nature itself. The imprisonment of Jeffrey Dahmer at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, marked the beginning of what many assumed would be the final chapter of one of America's most notorious criminal cases. Sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, Dahmer faced the prospect of spending the remainder of his days confined in a maximum security facility, isolated from the society he had terrorized for over a decade. However, even behind bars, the Dahmer case continued to generate controversy, media attention, and troubling questions about justice, mental health treatment, and the nature of punishment. Initially placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, Dahmer's early months in prison were marked by threats from other inmates and the need for extraordinary security measures. Prison officials were well aware that many inmates viewed child killers and those who committed particularly heinous crimes as legitimate targets for violence. The fact that many of Dahmer's victims had been young men of color added another layer of danger, as African-American inmates might view attacks on Dahmer as justified revenge for his crimes. Despite these security concerns, Dahmer reportedly adapted to prison life with the same methodical approach he had brought to his crimes. Guards described him as a quiet, compliant inmate who followed rules and caused few problems. He spent much of his time reading, writing letters, and engaging with the various mental health professionals who continued to study his case. This apparent normalcy in prison was consistent with his ability to maintain a facade of ordinary behavior while committing his murders, demonstrating his capacity for compartmentalization and adaptation. The question of mental health treatment for Dahmer became a subject of ongoing debate among prison officials, mental health professionals, and the public. While clearly suffering from severe psychological disorders, Dahmer was housed in a correctional facility rather than a mental health institution, reflecting the jury's verdict that he was legally sane and therefore subject to punishment rather than treatment. However, this arrangement raised questions about whether the goals of punishment and public safety were best served by traditional incarceration or by intensive psychiatric intervention. Dr. George Palermo continued to interview Dahmer regularly during his imprisonment, attempting to gain further insight into his psychological development and the factors that had driven his crimes. These interviews revealed additional details about Dahmer's childhood, his progressive mental deterioration, and his own understanding of his criminal behavior. However, they also demonstrated the limits of psychological analysis in fully explaining crimes of such magnitude and depravity. The media attention surrounding Dahmer continued unabated during his imprisonment, with numerous books, articles, and documentaries attempting to explain his crimes and their significance. This ongoing coverage kept the case in the public consciousness and continued to generate revenue for publishers, filmmakers, and others who capitalized on the public's morbid fascination with his story. Critics argued that this attention glorified Dahmer and potentially inspired copycat crimes, while others maintained that studying his case was necessary for understanding and preventing similar crimes. The families of Dahmer's victims faced ongoing trauma as the case remained in the public eye. Many struggled with the knowledge that their loved one's suffering was being exploited for commercial gain, and that Dahmer himself had become a celebrity of sorts. Some families pursued civil litigation against various parties they held responsible for failing to prevent the crimes, including the city of Milwaukee, the apartment complex where Dahmer lived, and others whose negligence may have contributed to their losses. The systemic failures that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long became the subject of intensive review and reform efforts. The Milwaukee Police Department implemented new training programs focused on domestic violence, missing persons investigations, and sensitivity toward minority communities. Social service agencies revised their procedures for monitoring probationers and responding to complaints about suspicious behavior. However, critics argued that these reforms were inadequate and that more fundamental changes were needed to prevent similar tragedies. The gay community in Milwaukee and beyond struggled with the aftermath of Dahmer's crimes and their implications for LGBTQ+ safety and visibility. The fact that Dahmer had targeted gay men and had used gay bars and venues as hunting grounds created additional trauma for a community already facing significant discrimination and violence. Some activists argued that homophobia had contributed to the inadequate police response to missing person reports and other warning signs, while others worried that the case would increase prejudice against gay men. The racial dimensions of Dahmer's crimes also continued to generate discussion and controversy. The fact that the majority of his victims were men of color, and that several opportunities to stop him had been missed by authorities, led to ongoing questions about whether racial bias had played a role in the investigation and prevention failures. Community leaders argued that the cases would have received more attention and resources if the victims had been white, while others maintained that the focus should be on improving services for all vulnerable populations. On November 28, 1994, just over 2 years into his sentence, Jeffrey Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate at Columbia Correctional Institution. Christopher Scarver, a 25-year-old African-American man serving a life sentence for murder, attacked Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, with a metal bar while they were cleaning a prison bathroom. Both Dahmer and Anderson died from their injuries, bringing an abrupt end to Dahmer's life and eliminating any possibility of further insight into his crimes. The murder of Dahmer in prison was met with mixed reactions from the public and the families of his victims. Some viewed it as poetic justice, arguing that Dahmer had received the violent death that his crimes deserved. Others expressed concern about the implications of vigilante justice in the prison system and questioned whether adequate security measures had been in place to protect high-profile inmates. A few family members of victims expressed disappointment that Dahmer's death had eliminated any possibility of gaining additional information about their loved one's final moments. Scarver later claimed that he had killed Dahmer because he was disgusted by his crimes and believed that prison officials had deliberately placed them together, knowing that violence was likely to result. He described Dahmer as unrepentant and claimed that he had taunted other inmates by shaping his food to resemble body parts and using ketchup to simulate blood. However, these claims were disputed by prison officials and others who had observed Dahmer's behavior in prison. The investigation into Dahmer's death revealed security lapses and procedural failures that had made the attack possible. The 3 inmates had been left unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes while cleaning the bathroom, providing Scarver with the opportunity to carry out his assault. Prison officials were criticized for failing to adequately protect high-profile inmates and for not properly assessing the risks involved in housing certain inmates together. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of his personal story, but not the end of his impact on American society and culture. His crimes had exposed fundamental flaws in multiple systems designed to protect public safety and had forced uncomfortable conversations about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and social inequality. The case had also demonstrated the particular vulnerability of marginalized communities and the deadly consequences of institutional indifference to their welfare. In the years following Dahmer's death, his case continued to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals, seeking to understand the factors that create serial killers and to develop better methods for identifying and stopping them before they can claim multiple victims. The failures that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long served as cautionary tales about the importance of taking seriously reports of suspicious behavior and the need for better coordination between different agencies and jurisdictions. The cultural impact of the Dahmer case extended far beyond academic and professional circles. His story became part of American folklore, inspiring countless books, films, documentaries, and other media that attempted to explain or exploit his crimes. This ongoing fascination reflected deeper questions about the nature of evil and humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction. The case had challenged basic assumptions about the possibility of redemption and the limits of human understanding. The families of Dahmer's victims continued to struggle with their losses and the ongoing public attention to the case long after his death. Many found it difficult to achieve closure when their loved ones' stories remained subjects of public fascination and commercial exploitation. Some became advocates for victims' rights and criminal justice reform, channeling their grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Others retreated from public attention, seeking privacy and healing away from the media spotlight. The Dahmer case also had lasting implications for how society understands and responds to mental illness in the criminal justice context. The trial had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of the insanity defense, showing that even obviously disturbed defendants could be held legally responsible for their crimes if they retained basic understanding of right and wrong. This had important implications for how mentally ill defendants are treated and for the resources devoted to mental health treatment in correctional settings. The systemic reforms implemented in response to Dahmer's crimes represented steps toward better protection of vulnerable populations, but critics argued that much more needed to be done to address the underlying social conditions that had made his victims targets. Issues of poverty, discrimination, substance abuse, and social marginalization continued to create vulnerable populations that could be exploited by predators. The case had shown that protecting society from individuals like Dahmer required not just better law enforcement, but also addressing the broader social inequalities that created victims. More than 3 decades after Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, his case continues to serve as a disturbing reminder of humanity's capacity for evil and the importance of vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable members. The story of his crimes and their aftermath offers sobering lessons about the complexity of human nature, the limitations of institutional responses to deviant behavior, and the ongoing challenges of creating a just and safe society. While Dahmer himself is gone, the questions raised by his crimes remain relevant to contemporary discussions about mental health, criminal justice, and social responsibility. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer extends far beyond the specific crimes he committed, representing a watershed moment in American understanding of serial murder, mental illness, and the failures of social institutions. His case forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of marginalized communities, the limitations of mental health and criminal justice systems, and the persistent challenges of identifying and stopping predatory individuals before they can claim multiple victims. The enduring fascination with Dahmer's story reflects deeper questions about the nature of evil and the human capacity for both empathy and cruelty. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing acts of unprecedented depravity challenged basic assumptions about the recognizability of dangerous individuals and the reliability of social institutions to protect vulnerable populations. The case demonstrated that monsters can hide in plain sight, living and working among ordinary people who never suspect the horrors being committed in their midst. Perhaps most troubling of all, the Dahmer case revealed how societal indifference and institutional failures can create conditions that allow predators to operate with impunity. The systemic racism, homophobia, and classism that contributed to the inadequate response to missing person reports and other warning signs showed that protecting vulnerable populations requires more than just better law enforcement. It demands fundamental changes in how society values and protects all of its members. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer serves as both a horror story and a cautionary tale, reminding us that the price of indifference can be measured in human lives, and that true justice requires not just punishment after the fact, but prevention through vigilance, compassion, and social responsibility.